An ancient Ethiopian book, sealed for centuries, was finally scanned by modern artificial intelligence. Hidden lines appeared inside pages untouched for 2,000 years. What surfaced is not a headline, but a whisper. Words that change how we imagine the years after the empty tomb. Scholars are stunned, monks are silent, and a message begins to spread. Prepare to hear a story the world was never meant to forget. AI reveals ancient secrets after years. After thousands of years of silence, artificial intelligence has scanned the Ethiopian Bible and revealed what Jesus said after his resurrection. This discovery is shaking the foundations of what we thought we knew about early Christianity. But to understand why this matters, we need to travel back in time to a civilization that quietly guarded secrets the rest of the world forgot. When historians tell the story of Christianity, they usually begin in Rome or Constantinople. They speak of emperors and councils, of cathedrals rising from European soil. Yet far from these centers of power, hidden in the highlands of East Africa, one of Christianity's oldest guardians has endured for nearly 2 millennia. Ethiopia's connection to Christianity dates back to the 4th century AD. This ancient kingdom became one of the earliest nations on earth to adopt Christianity as its official religion. And here is what makes this remarkable. Ethiopia made this decision decades before the Roman Empire officially embraced the faith. This early conversion placed Ethiopia not on the margins of Christian history, but at its very foundation. Unlike other Christian nations, Ethiopian Christianity developed largely independent of Western Christendom. While it maintained connections to early Eastern Christian communities through Egypt, it evolved in ways shaped by local culture, geography, and ancient tradition. Most importantly, Ethiopia was never fully conquered or culturally overwritten by foreign empires. This isolation allowed Ethiopian Christianity to preserve forms of belief, worship, and scripture that elsewhere were altered, suppressed, or lost entirely. The living language of ancient faith link. One of the clearest signs of this preservation is the continued use of Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that serves as the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church. Though no longer spoken in everyday conversation, Ge'ez remains alive in worship and scripture. It serves as a living archive of early Christian theology, a window into beliefs that existed before later doctrinal revisions reshaped Christianity elsewhere. Think about what this means. While Latin became a dead language in Western churches and Greek evolved beyond its ancient form, Ge'ez continued to serve its original purpose, connecting believers directly to the words and ideas of the earliest Christians. Every Sunday, Ethiopian priests chant prayers in the same language used to write these ancient scriptures. The connection is unbroken, a living thread stretching back through the centuries. Manuscripts written in Ge'ez, some of them centuries old, survive today in remarkable condition. These documents offer insights into biblical traditions that predate many of the theological debates that would later define Western Christianity. They contain prayers, teachings, and entire books that most Christians today have never heard of. Over the centuries, Ethiopia's monasteries became sanctuaries not only for monks but for sacred texts themselves. Nestled in remote mountains and highland regions, these monastic communities safeguarded parchment manuscripts through war, political upheaval, and theological conflict. While councils in Europe debated which books should be considered scripture, Ethiopian monks continued copying, reading, and living the scriptures as they had received them from their ancestors. This continuity makes Ethiopian Christianity one of the most ancient and uninterrupted streams of Christian thought still in existence. In a world where religious history is often told by victors and empires, Ethiopia stands as a quiet counterexample. Its churches, carved from rock and crowned with incense smoke, remain living witnesses to a Christianity older than cathedrals, older than creeds, and older than the political structures we call Christendom. For many Christians around the world, the Bible is a fixed collection of texts. Protestants recognize 66 books, Catholics accept 73. Eastern Orthodox traditions include a few more. Yet in Ethiopia, the boundaries of Scripture were never narrowed in the same way. And this difference changes everything we think we know about the biblical canon. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves the most expansive biblical canon in the Christian world. Their tradition recognizes 81 books consisting of 46 Old Testament books and 35 New Testament books. This alone sets Ethiopian Christianity apart from every other branch of the faith, but the true uniqueness lies in which books were preserved and why they matter. Some modern scholars and manuscript traditions even identify expanded Ethiopian canons reaching 88 books, incorporating additional apocryphal and liturgical texts. Among the most famous texts preserved only in Ethiopia is Fan Enoch, an ancient text filled with apocalyptic visions, descriptions of angelic hierarchies, and prophecies of cosmic judgment. While Enoch is actually quoted in the New Testament book of Jude and was widely read in early Christianity, Western churches eventually excluded it from their biblical canons. In Ethiopia, however, it was never lost. Preserved in Ge'ez manuscripts, it remains scripture rather than speculation. Another key text is the Book of Jubilees, a detailed retelling of Genesis and early biblical history that emphasizes divine law, sacred time, and covenant. Jubilees was influential among early Jewish and Christian communities, but disappeared almost entirely from Western tradition. Ethiopia's manuscripts preserve it in full, offering a window into how early believers understood creation, angels, and divine order. The Ethiopian canon also includes 3 books of Maccabean, which are often mistakenly confused with the books of Maccabees found in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. In reality, these are entirely different texts with distinct narratives, theological emphases, and moral teachings. Their inclusion reflects Ethiopia's independent textual lineage rather than dependence on traditions that developed in the Greek and Roman world. In most Christian traditions, the story of Jesus' teachings effectively ends with the resurrection appearances recorded in the Gospels and the opening chapters of Acts. What follows is apostolic preaching, church formation, and theology developed by early communities. Yet within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, there exists a text that points to something more, teachings attributed to Jesus after his resurrection and before his ascension. Teachings that remain largely unknown to the wider Christian world. This text is known as the Book of the Covenant, or Mashafa Kidon in Ge'ez. It is a work included within the broader Ethiopian biblical canon. The Book of the Covenant is composed of 60 sections that outline early church order, moral instruction, and guidelines for communal life. Following these sections comes a concluding portion that Ethiopian tradition describes as containing post-resurrection discourses of Jesus himself. The reason these teachings remain largely unknown lies in history rather than theology. Preserved in Ge'ez, the Book of the Covenant remained isolated from the theological debates that shaped Western and Eastern Orthodox canons. As councils narrowed definitions of Scripture elsewhere, Ethiopian Christianity continued transmitting texts through worship, monastic study, and manuscript preservation. Because these writings were never widely translated or circulated beyond Ethiopia, they were never evaluated or excluded by other Christian authorities. Unlike the canonical Gospels familiar in Western Christianity, these teachings do not dwell on miracles, parables, or debates with religious authorities. Instead, they focus on inner transformation, spiritual discipline, and the lived reality of resurrection faith. The resurrected Christ, as presented in Ethiopian tradition, speaks less about institutional structure and more about the inward renewal required of those who follow him. Themes such as love, humility, purity of heart, and divine knowledge recur throughout these traditions. Salvation is portrayed not merely as forgiveness of sins or a future reward after death, but as an inner awakening. It is described as a restoration of the soul's alignment with God. The resurrection in this view is not only an event to be believed in, it is a state to be entered. Believers are called to embody resurrection life through compassion, self-emptying, and spiritual awareness. Across Ethiopian Christian literature, a consistent theme emerges. Spiritual life is not defined primarily by external obedience, but by a transformative inner journey. Faith is something lived within the soul before it is expressed through ritual or institution. This perspective runs deeply through Ethiopian canonical texts such as 1 Enoch and Jubilees, and it presents a vision of Christianity that feels both ancient and strikingly relevant to seekers today. These writings open a window into an ancient worldview where the universe is alive with spiritual meaning. West Enoch, in particular, offers vivid visions of heavenly realms, angelic hierarchies, and cosmic conflict. It describes the throne of God surrounded by radiant beings, the movement of angels through the heavens, and the moral structure of the unseen world. Far from speculative mythology, these visions reflect how early Jewish and Christian communities understood reality. The visible world was inseparable from the invisible one, and human life unfolded within a larger spiritual cosmos. Jubilees complements this vision by reframing biblical history as a sacred timeline governed by divine order. It emphasizes moral responsibility, covenantal faithfulness, and the idea that human actions resonate beyond the material world. Together, these texts present a universe in which the soul's orientation toward light or darkness matters more than external conformity. Within Ethiopian Christian tradition, the soul is understood as the true dwelling place of God. Spiritual growth is described not as acquiring authority or status, but as awakening to the divine presence already planted within the human person. This inner light is not self-generated, it is the reflection of God's image restored through humility, love, and moral courage. The resurrection of Christ in this framework becomes the model for inner renewal rather than merely a historical miracle to be commemorated. This emphasis stands in sharp contrast to later forms of Christianity that increasingly prioritized institutional authority, legal theology, and doctrinal uniformity. Ethiopian Christianity preserved a vision in which salvation was deeply personal, inward, and transformative. Yet it was never disconnected from communal life and moral responsibility. The individual's inner journey was always meant to overflow into how they treated others. Death, accordingly, is not viewed as an end, but as a transition. It is a movement from one mode of existence to another. Ethiopian texts echo early mystical thought in portraying the soul's journey beyond the body, passing through spiritual realms shaped by one's moral and spiritual life. What matters most is not ritual precision, but inner purity, vigilance, and alignment with divine truth. Why Rome rejected these teachings? Link. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, it faced a challenge far greater than persecution, the challenge of unity. Diverse communities from Syria to Egypt, from Rome to the edges of Africa, read different texts, emphasized different teachings, and expressed faith through distinct traditions. To govern a rapidly expanding religion within a vast empire, church leaders increasingly sought a standardized body of scripture that could unify doctrine, worship, and authority. Councils such as the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD played a major role in shaping this process. While Nicaea itself did not finalize the biblical canon, it marked a turning point where theological agreement and political stability became tightly connected. In the centuries that followed, church leaders in both the Western and Eastern Roman worlds gradually narrowed the list of accepted texts. Books that were widely read in some regions but not universally recognized were set aside. Writings such as 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and the Maccabean books were excluded and labeled apocryphal or non-canonical. This exclusion was not simply about authenticity. Many of these texts were ancient, respected, and in some cases quoted by early Christian writers. Rather, the process was shaped by political, theological, and liturgical priorities. Church authorities favored writings that reinforced hierarchical leadership, doctrinal clarity, and uniform teaching across the empire. Texts that emphasized mystical experience, complex cosmologies, or alternative theological perspectives were more difficult to control and standardize. Mystical writings posed a particular challenge. Texts like 1 Enoch presented expansive visions of angels, heavenly realms, and divine judgment that did not easily fit into the increasingly structured theology of imperial Christianity. Others emphasized inner transformation over external authority, placing spiritual insight within the believer rather than exclusively within church institutions. From the perspective of imperial administration, such ideas risked fragmentation and dissent. Meanwhile, Ethiopia stood apart, geographically distant and never fully absorbed into the Roman or Byzantine political system. The Ethiopian church was free from the pressures that shaped Western and Eastern canon formation. As a result, Ethiopia continued to preserve texts that other churches abandoned. Within Ethiopian Christian tradition, the story of Jesus is remembered not only through suffering and sacrifice, but through teaching, transformation, and peace. While mainstream Christianity places the cross and resurrection at the center of faith, the Ethiopian canon gives sustained attention to what Jesus taught and how those teachings were meant to reshape human life from within. Ethiopian texts, such as the Book of the Covenant, emphasize Jesus as a teacher of spiritual awakening. Rather than focusing heavily on institutional authority or ecclesiastical hierarchy, these traditions highlight unity, humility, and inner renewal. Jesus is portrayed not only as the crucified and risen Lord, but as a divine instructor whose words were intended to restore harmony. Harmony between humanity and God, between people themselves, and even between humanity and all of creation. This theological texture, blending wisdom, mysticism, and ethical transformation, creates a portrait of Christianity that feels both ancient and strikingly relevant. It is a Christianity less concerned with power and more concerned with awakening, less focused on control and more focused on peace. Within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition, this was not an alternative Christianity. It was simply Christianity as it had always been received and preserved. In this perspective, peace is not merely political or social, it is spiritual alignment. The Ethiopian tradition frames salvation as a lived reality, something embodied through love, moral courage, and purity of heart. Resurrection faith is expressed less through doctrinal formulas and more through transformation of character. To live according to Christ's teaching is to participate in the life he revealed. Some Ethiopian traditions preserve accounts of extended instruction given by Jesus after the resurrection. These teachings, rather than repeating the narratives found in the Western Gospels, focus on ethical guidance, spiritual illumination, and preparation of the disciples for a world that would soon misunderstand or distort his message. The risen Christ speaks not as a distant ruler, but as a guide. He clarifies truths meant to be carried forward through lived example rather than enforced belief. Within these writings, Jesus appears as a universal teacher, drawing on the moral depth of early Jewish wisdom while expressing the spiritual immediacy of early Christian experience. His message transcends ethnic and cultural boundaries, emphasizing compassion, mercy, and reconciliation. Toward the close of the Ethiopian canon, a recurring and sobering theme emerges. Faith can decay when it becomes only external. Several Ethiopian texts convey a prophetic vision of Christianity's future, warning that ritual hierarchy and public devotion mean little if they are severed from inner transformation. What ultimately matters, these writings insist, is not outward religion but the condition of the soul. At the heart of this vision is the image of divine fire. This is not a fire of destruction, but of illumination. True faith is described as an inner flame, a living awareness of God that burns away pride, falsehood, and spiritual complacency. This fire is not maintained by institutions or enforced belief, but by humility, love, and moral courage. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Spirit of Christ continues to speak to humanity through the awakened heart, not primarily through power structures or religious systems. This warning is not unique to later Ethiopian writings. It echoes powerfully through canonical texts such as 1 Enoch and Jubilees. In these books, visions of judgment are never merely punitive. They are revelatory, exposing the true state of human hearts. The righteous are not those who perform rituals flawlessly, but those who cultivate purity, justice, and faithfulness in hidden places. Judgment in this sense is the unveiling of truth rather than the imposition of punishment. 1 Enoch portrays a cosmos where moral reality is woven into the fabric of existence. Angels fall not because of ritual failure, but because of corruption and arrogance. Humanity is judged not by status or lineage, but by alignment with righteousness. Jubilees frames history itself as a moral test, urging vigilance, humility, and devotion rooted in sincerity rather than appearance. Together, these texts call believers to live as though the unseen world is real, because in their worldview it absolutely is. The Ethiopian tradition preserves a form of Christianity that consistently warns against empty religion. Faith that lacks inner renewal becomes brittle, performative, and ultimately powerless. The fire of truth, by contrast, refines rather than flatters. It challenges believers to confront their own hearts before attempting to correct the world. Despite centuries of marginalization by dominant Christian traditions, these writings endured. They were copied by hand, prayed over, and lived out within Ethiopian monastic and communal life. They were not preserved as curiosities or historical artifacts, but as spiritual necessities. To the Ethiopian Church, these texts were never dangerous or subversive. They were simply honest. Their survival raises an unsettling possibility. If ancient Christianity preserved a vision of faith centered on inner awakening rather than outward conformity, then much of what later defined religion may be incomplete or even distorted. The Ethiopian canon stands as a quiet reminder that Christianity once spoke more boldly about the soul, the unseen world, and humanity's responsibility to live truthfully before God. Because these teachings were transmitted in Ge'ez manuscripts, taught within monastic communities and woven into liturgical life, they remained largely unknown outside Ethiopia. As Western Christianity developed around creeds, councils, and institutions, this quieter tradition continued to speak of inner light, moral responsibility, and harmony with God's order. Two parallel streams of Christianity, flowing from the same source but arriving in very different places. Now, with modern technology allowing scholars to scan and analyze these ancient manuscripts like never before, we are only beginning to understand what has been preserved in these highland monasteries for 2,000 years. Artificial intelligence is helping researchers decode texts that have remained unread for centuries. Digital imaging reveals faded ink that human eyes could never see. New discoveries are being made with each passing month, and the more we learn, the more questions arise about what else might be waiting to be found. These ancient words have survived time, silence, and secrecy to reach us today. They traveled through centuries, preserved by faithful hands in mountain monasteries, waiting for the moment when technology would finally allow us to rediscover what was nearly lost. The Ethiopian Bible is not just a collection of forgotten books, it is a mirror reflecting a Christianity that existed before empires shaped doctrine, before councils narrowed scripture, and before institutions decided what faith should look like. It reminds us that the story of Jesus and his teachings may be far richer and more complex than any single tradition can contain. For those who have always felt that there was something more to the story, that perhaps the earliest Christians understood something we have forgotten, the Ethiopian tradition offers a profound invitation. It invites us to look beyond the familiar narratives and discover teachings that emphasize inner transformation over external conformity, personal awakening over institutional obedience, and divine presence within the soul over distant theological abstractions. If this ancient fire of truth still burns in hidden texts, the next revelation may redefine how humanity understands its own spiritual destiny. The monasteries of Ethiopia have kept these flames alive for 2,000 years. Now, as artificial intelligence helps us read what human eyes could not decipher for centuries, we stand at the threshold of discoveries that could reshape our understanding of the most influential figure in human history. These ancient words have survived time, silence, and secrecy to reach us today. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what this revelation means to you.